Masters tournament starts up again this upcoming spring. So if you want to head start in the Masters, just grab an oar and get to rowing. I'll see you there in a few months. Once again, that's Augusta, 130 miles upriver. The river then winds down from Augusta through Savannah, where we are right now, and then it winds out to sea, out to the Atlantic Ocean, which is only about 15.5 to 16 miles downriver, or 15.5 miles behind you. So you guys are actually pretty close to the coastline as we speak, pretty close to the ocean. Now folks, because the Savannah River feeds out into the ocean, and because of its unique positioning along the coast, it's actually considered an intercoastal system, a waterway system, whereby the river itself is impacted by the tide. When you're thinking about the tide, you normally associate that with the ocean. You don't really think about river systems much when you're talking about the tide. But friends, here in the Savannah River, we experience tidal swings every single day. We have 2 low tide and 2 high tide swings. They happen about every 6 hours or so, and they have some notable effects on the river. One of the most obvious ones is that the tidal swing will change the direction of the current. So if you're familiar with the Mississippi River, then you're aware of the fact that the Mississippi is always running one way, it's always running out. It's going from north to south, feeding out to the ocean at all times. There's one notable exception in the river where it randomly goes up, but friends, mostly it's going out, it's feeding out to the sea. Folks, here in the Savannah River, the tidal swing will completely change the direction of the current. One moment it's running out to sea, which would be the ebb tide, and then 6 hours later that tidal swing will happen, and then it'll begin to flood, and so the river will be coming in from the ocean. In addition to the direction changing, the speed of the current will also change, anywhere between 3 and 5, sometimes even up to 6 miles per hour. Now friends, about 5 or 6 knots, that really doesn't sound like a whole lot to the driver's ear, but guys, I promise you, if you're out on the water, you are definitely going to feel a 6 mile per hour current. It's a very fast current. It's one of the many reasons why this event, folks, actually not a very safe place to swim. You wouldn't actually want to be in the Savannah River without being on a vessel like you guys are, without having a life preserver. The Navy will back me up on that, so will the U.S. Coast Guard. And friends, if none of that is really enough to convince you that it's a bad idea, it is also just straight up against the law to enter the Savannah River. So not a good idea. If you have any kiddos pulling at you trying to jump in the river this week, just go ahead and dissuade them from that, discourage that idea. Once again, the speed of the current is certainly one of those reasons. Now folks, we also notice that the depth change between low and high tide all the way up to 8, sometimes even up to 10 feet, folks, between low and high tide. Very significant depth change. One of the highest depth changes in the country as far as between low and high tide. But folks, maybe the most interesting thing that I see happening in the river as a consequence of the tide is actually the churning effect that happens in the water. So this is what happens. We'll have fresh water that starts 300 miles upriver in Lake Hartwell. That's being pulled out to sea by the ebb tide, and then 6 hours go by, and then the tidal swing happens. I'll go ahead and tell you that we are, because of our proximity to the ocean, much more salty than we are fresh. I think that's worth noting, but still considered brackish water, technically speaking, with it being a mixture of the two. But folks, the thing to sort of know about this brackish water, I would say the characteristic that's worth taking away about it is the fact that it is very nutrient rich. It's jam-packed with nutrients, making it an optimal place for a healthy ecosystem to be thriving, teeming with wildlife. In other words, it's just a never-ending buffet for the creatures that call it home. They really never have a reason to leave, because it's always providing the nutrients that they require. All types of creatures call the river home. Fish of the Atlantic and freshwater variety. They're birds of prey like hawks and seagulls, pelicans, even bald eagles that nest in the island here. Manatees especially will take respite further upriver during the winter months. Otters like to crab on the docks. We've got the American alligator. And friends, maybe our very favorite here on the Georgia bottlenose dolphin. busiest shipping port in the United States, as well as the largest and fastest growing container port in particular. As Captain Richard's doing a bit of a U-turn in the wheelhouse right now, he's actually exposing our port side to a great visual demonstration of this, that being the Eugene Talmadge Memorial Bridge. If you're on the left side of the Georgia Queen, you're getting kind of see the bridge and all of its breadth here. Folks, that's the second largest bridge in the state of Georgia. Iconic piece of our city skyline, of course. Kind of want to bring your attention, though, not to the bridge itself, but actually the series of towers on the other side. So right underneath it, on either side, you kind of see the sequence of towers that are holding nothing up at the moment. Some of them have some vegetation growth on them, so they've obviously been there a while. Folks, those actually held the previous bridge, the old bridge from the 1950s, which is awesome, right? Because now we get to see this visual demonstration of the growth from the old to the new. But folks, let me tell you, not a flippant, casual project to build that new bridge. Very much a lot of stress, a lot of pressure on that decision. And that's because in the mid-'80s, we were experiencing such a growth of our port economy. It was booming, and the shipping traffic was growing in volume and in size. And get this, guys, by the late 80s, 2 vessels had physically struck the bridge. They hit the bridge. And so Georgia had a dilemma to they had a question to answer. Do we continue to invest in the shipping industry, or do we get out while we can? Of course, they made their decision in 1991. The Eugene Talmadge was finished. That old bridge that had a clearance of 135 feet over high tide. The new one has a clearance of 185 feet over high tide. But friends, let me remind you, as we're actually about to pass back underneath in the next few moments, that was in 1991. You guys find yourselves here today aboard the Georgia Queen, the year of our Lord 2023. And guess what sailors do today? Crewmen will come through on ships through the river. They'll stand on the tippity top of their ship, sort of like I am right now. They will reach up and just touch the underside of the Eugene Talmadge Memorial Bridge. Almost like a middle schooler running through a hallway and touching the doorway on the way out, just because they can. Now, you guys are wise enough to surmise on your own that that's probably cutting it a bit too close, right? Cutting it too close for comfort. But fret not, everybody. Pen, zip, paper, yet another project has actually been greenlit for the bridge to be expanded once more. Just like in 1990, they're going to long. It's over a mile wide. Despite it having used to be just marshlands, now there's the Savannah Convention Center, the luxury Westin Hotel, both of which are very popular wedding destination corporate venues. They've got a golf course over there. They've got a racetrack. And friends, maybe its most notable inhabitant, you might guess this one if you know that where there are golf courses, there are oftentimes also alligators. That's right, folks. The American alligator actually calls the island home, and it is unfettered, unchecked, no natural predator. It just kind of roams. And I believe that the brackish water here is a bit too salty for their taste, because it's our observation that they tend to prefer to spend the majority of their time up on the banks and the marshes of the island itself, rather than spending the majority of their time here in the water, like you sort of might assume an alligator would. But interestingly enough, in their DNA, biologically, like a lot of animals do, they sort of innately understand the healing properties that salt water can have for their bodies. You see, guys, a lot of animals, they just kind of automatically get this, that salt water is good for them, for their skin, for healing wounds and things like that. And so from time to time, we will see the gator cooling off out, enjoying the water, swimming around. The last several gators I've seen here in the river, they've just been floating by one of the many docks or simply swimming from one side to the other, usually right there on the surface of there. Now, friends, for many of you, you might have grown up in a town that had a rail cart system. And so for you, it just looks like any old piece of the backdrop of any given town, USA, right? It really doesn't signify much visually. But friends, for us here in the port, that rail cart system is actually a really important facet of the port. It's an important piece of our system of impacting the U.S. economy. It's honestly a big part of the reason why we're able to benefit 71% of the United States economy. And the reason for that is the beating heart of our port economy is our container traffic. Now, folks, when I say containers, I'm talking about those 40-foot-long prism-like containers. You see them on the back of semi-trucks and 18-wheelers on the interstate. If you watch the film Captain Phillips that stars Tom Hanks, if you're familiar with that movie, the vessel his character helmed in that movie, that was a perfect example of the container ships. We see the Alabama Maersk in that movie. There's also several of them shark vacuum on our doorstep in a week or less. You know, guys, the shipping industry has a huge part to play in that process. We're happy to contribute to that economy at large with our container traffic in particular. Once again, the biggest and fastest growing container port in the United States. Now, we just passed by a pretty mighty vessel off the starboard side, the right side, and we're passing by another one in the next few moments. Folks, both of these are the same type of ship. Neither of them are container ships by any stretch of the imagination. But they're also very important and frequent vessels we see. Both of these are what are referred to as break bulk carriers. So large vessels, they've got the very, very large cargo holds that have the vertically open doors that you see. It's always reminded me of Jurassic Park 2. The T-Rex comes out of the big cargo hold from the late 90s. Do y'all remember that one? I think of that every time. Y'all know what I'm talking about. You young lady with the green offshoot to the river. It looks like a stream coming off of the river with some trees and grasslands over here. Now, friends, I wanted to sort of bring up this area briefly because it's where the Southeastern Shipbuilding Corporation used to operate out of. It's actually a very important aspect of the port, historically speaking, because that's where 88 Liberty ships were built. Guys, that was one of Georgia's larger contributions to the war efforts during the Second World War. Now, just a brief history review to sort of beat you up on the Liberty ships. Folks, Second World War, our English allies, they were in a bad way. They were in big trouble. German U-boats were taking down their ships left and right, so Britain called for aid. Eventually, America was able to answer that call. And it was during that time that the United States created several hundred of what's known as the Liberty ships. They were built right here in the United States with the express purpose of being sent out to help our English allies. Like I said, right here off the starboard side, 88 of those Liberty ships were built and sent out to sea to help our friends. Now, these Liberty ships, folks, they were being sent out to provide military support, of course, but they were also full of food and supplies and all types of things that you wouldn't necessarily guess. Anything that we could do to help out our allies. As a matter of fact, if there's any farmers aboard today, you might know this already, but we actually sent as many tractors as we could get our hands on too. We sent tractors over to England to expedite food growth during that time of crisis. And get this, folks, by the time the dust settled from World War II, Britain's agriculture had been almost completely mechanized. Up until the war, you see, folks, Britain was still almost exclusively relying on all the old methods of farming, the old manual methods of farming, and the American imp, the Liberty ships, actually changed that forever. 4/5 of Britain's farmers left the farms in the coming 2 decades. So the Liberty ships, I just say that to say, the Liberty ships had all manner of impacts and sort of consequences moving forward. But there's a problem with them that I think is worth mentioning, and that's that riveting was the technique used to put ships together. They were riveted together at the seams, panel by panel, using the system of rivets. It was tried and true. It worked great, but friends, it took a long time to do. It took a long process riveting a ship together. Sometimes that would be weeks or months at a time. And like I said, folks, so many men were away being obligated to fight, which, by the way, folks, let me just tell you, I think that is an amazing example of how sometimes the chips are down, right? The resources are scarce, and yet that pressure actually causes the fruit to bloom. Despite the adversity that we were facing as a nation, we sort of just think that's an amazing testimony to the legacy of that industry and the welding industry. And I also regard them as heroes because those welders went out and risked their lives right alongside our warriors during that war on the Liberty ships. That reminds me, folks, if you would please join me in a round of applause for all of our veterans, our fallen heroes, our active duty. We love you guys. We appreciate you. The men and women aboard today that have served, thank you so much for your service. We couldn't live this life without you. Not the way we do. All right, ladies and gentlemen,
You're
pop
welcome.
quiz. I'm going to see who's been hanging out with me on the narration today. Do you guys remember when I said that the Savannah River acts as the dividing line between Georgia and South Carolina? That's right. Look at you guys. 1,000 points to Gryffindor in the fourth deck. That's a millennial reference that I won't care to explain. Well, you might also recall that I said that was the case except for at this very moment, because looking off the port side, the left side, we're still looking at Georgia, right? This is Hutchinson Island, Georgia. Talked about the Gators over there. Well, friends, if you're looking at the island, you're going to notice getting skinnier by the second. We're actually passing by the edge of Hutchinson Island, meaning what you see just beyond it is, in fact, South Carolina. So we're actually approaching South Carolina now. Because we're approaching South Carolina, folks, this would be a good time for anybody. If you need to step out to one of the outer decks in a quiet spot and call your roll officer, now would be a good time to do that. I would hate for anybody's ankle bracelet to go off on the boat. That would be really embarrassing. So just let them know you're approaching the state line. Give them a call. They'd appreciate that. You might also notice a little ship poking its head out of the water over there in the back river. That's our very own shipwreck. That was an old dredging ship, guys. Dredging ship. The crew, they left there overnight for some reason, and they anchored down in the back river. There was some sort of mechanical safety oversight that took place. I'm not sure still to this day exactly what took place, but they can move it. So they just elected to leave it there for our viewing pleasure. I'm really glad they did. I think it's really cool looking, especially at sunset. Great view of the bridge, the sunset, and the dredge ship all in one photo later on in the evening. Now, I mentioned that was a dredging ship at its heyday. I also mentioned that the island is actually the product of dredge material poured on for years and years. So you're hearing this dredge word a couple of times today. Folks, dredging is super important. It happens 365, believe it or not. And simply put, dredging is just the process of sucking up that silt and eroded material from the bottom of the river so that we can maintain a depth. You remember the ships, they're so tall, they're scraping the bridge, they need a high clearance to get through here. Well, friends, they also have very deep drafts, they need a depth clearance as well. So we dredge out the Savannah River to maintain a depth of at least 47 feet at low tide. That's recently increased, it's bound to continue to increase. If you look over at the South Carolina tree line, you might actually notice some sandy colored material kind of right above the trees. Just looks like dirt material right above the trees. It's actually dredge right there. It's what it looks like when it's been out in the sun for quite some time. Because every now and again, folks, what we like to do in Savannah is just take all of that dredge from the bottom of the river and free of charge. You're welcome. Now, ladies and gents, I do want to take a moment and introduce something that we're approaching off the starboard side. It's this red masonry brick structure. If you're on the bow of the Georgia Queen, or the front, you've already got a good look at it. What we're approaching here is the second oldest standing military structure in the state of Georgia. This is Old Fort Jackson. Not to be confused with Fort Jackson. So there's actually a distinction between Old Fort Jackson and Fort Jackson. It's interesting to keep that in mind. Now, let me tell you something, friends. Old Fort Jackson deserves its name. It was built on an old Revolutionary War battery. It officially began its construction in 1808 in anticipation of the War of 1812. So very old structure over here. The founding fathers, their boots would have trodden over the campus here. Now, today they operate as a museum. They do live cannon firings every day, live reenactments, and as a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, they're about to do a live cannon firing in the next few moments. So if you have any kids with you, I encourage you to warn them or cover their ears. If you have hearing aid in, you might turn it down a notch or two, because they're about to try to sink us, folks. If you catch the cannonball, you got a drink on me, by the way. I'll buy you a drink. If you catch the cannonball, she's 8 pounds. So brace yourself, folks. Look like coming out there to sea.
We're friendly. There you go, Artillery.
Round of applause, folks. Give them a round of applause. It's 11 days with no casualties, folks. That's a new record for us on the Georgia Queen. Now, like I said, guys, those are our friends at Old Fort Jackson. They do that cannon firing every day at around 1:45. They do live reenactments, and they've got a lot of cool resources to check out to just learn more about the fort's history. So if you get the chance, I certainly encourage you to go visit Old Fort Jackson. It's a great experience for the whole family to have, especially if you have ones in your family that love history or love military history in particular. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about the Old Fort's history right now, though, particularly how it pertains to the Civil War. So, friends, what you need to know about Old Fort Jackson, about the Savannah River during the Civil War, is this. This whole canal that we find ourselves in, very afternoon, it was lined to the teeth with cannons. Dozens and dozens of cannons stationed right here around the bend. 80 that we're aware of that were stationed here. I believe 86 was the confirmed cannons that were right here in the canal. Old Fort Jackson over there, folks, that was Confederate occupied at the time, as was the occupying power of Savannah. And the Union Army, they had a blockade out at sea, which if you're on the front of the vessel, that's where you're looking out towards the ocean. And Captain Richard's actually swinging the starboard side towards the ocean. So if you're on the right side of the Georgia Queen, that's actually where you're about to be looking out towards the sea. So the Union Army, they had a blockade out there. And folks, I bring up the blockade because I think it's worth mentioning that it was effective to some measure. As you can imagine, a blockade towards the port, towards the entrance to the port rather, that would block certain resources, certain garrisons coming in to help the Confederates, right? And we would come to find out later, well, that the Confederate power here in Savannah would actually be a bit thin by the time it really mattered. And I have to believe that the blockade out there implicated that starting to starve the Confederates of certain resources. So I bring that up. Union Army had a blockade out there. That was great. It was effective. But folks, it's still important to understand coming in from the ocean and taking Savannah via the river was still very much a foolish notion. You have to get that picture that where we are this very afternoon was nigh impregnable, heavily fortified. Now thankfully General Sherman of the Union Army was wise enough of it to know that was the case. He knew that if he rolled up to the port here, he would have been peppered with cannon fire. He'd lost a lot of lives and a lot of resources needlessly. And so as preferable of a strategy as that might have been to sort of take Savannah via the coast, it just wasn't a tenable course of action. And Sherman knew that was the case. But here's the thing, folks. General Sherman, he still greatly coveted the city of Savannah. He wanted Savannah, folks, for its beauty, its resources, its positioning, and how it would impact the destiny of the war. Probably that last one most especially. And so Sherman came up with a plan to take Savannah. And ladies and gentlemen, his idea was pretty straightforward. I'm going to be honest. Sherman's idea was, if I cannot take Savannah from the sea, if I can't Savannah, and yet Sherman completely skirts around Augusta, he goes south through Macon instead. Now, folks, all of the facts have yet to rise to the surface, so nothing is completely confirmed with this. But, folks, most scholars, they heavily agree. They believe that Sherman deliberately spared the city of Augusta because of a woman that lived there in the city. More specific, a mistress that lived in the city, which is obviously wild to consider. Perhaps the fate of Augusta was in the hands of an affair taking place. The drama, right? Even in 18 whatever, guys are still being stupid and making terrible decisions. Further trivia for you guys. Evidently, Augusta is not the only city with heavy rumors of Sherman having lovers in those cities. So we have a little bit of a picture of what kind of gentleman General Sherman was. At any rate, him and his forces, they finally make their way to the western front of Savannah. Folks, the Confederates over there at Old Fort Jackson, they allocate their forces best they can to defend the western front, and they leave, get this, 3, count them, 1, 2, 3 soldiers to defend Old Fort Jackson over there. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever heard the phrase holding down the fort, or holding the fort down. That's possibly the worst example I can think of, holding down the fort. Not going to cut it.